Imagine this. You know the exact minute your life will end. No metaphor, no uncertainty. Just a ticking clock counting down to your execution. That was the reality for 61-year-old David Earl Miller, Tennessee's longest-serving death row inmate. On December 6, 2018, inside the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, Miller faced the decision no human being should ever have to make: electrocution or lethal injection. One promised unbearable pain, the other potentially worse. He chose the electric chair, not out of preference, but out of fear. Fear of a state-sanctioned injection protocol, so unreliable it bordered on torture. More than 1,750 volts of electricity would tear through his body. His legal team called it coercion. The U.S. Supreme Court called it justice. But Justice Sonia Sotomayor called it what it truly was: madness. Such madness should not continue. She wrote in her dissent words that now outlive the man they aimed to save. Miller's case wasn't just about punishment. It exposed a haunting contradiction at the core of American capital justice, a system that claims to seek fairness, but often delivers only questions. For Miller, death came not just by electricity, but through decades of delay, appeals, and bureaucracy. In his final 105 hours, the state choreographed every step of his death like a grim theater performance ritual disguised as routine. On December 3rd, guards transferred him to the Death Watch cell. There, under constant surveillance, he waited for a miracle, or the inevitable. On the evening of his execution, Miller requested a simple last meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, biscuits, and coffee. Comfort food for an uncomfortable end. Just 200 meters away, Governor Bill Haslam held the power to save him. His attorneys had filed an 89-page petition detailing years of abuse and untreated mental illness. They argued that both execution methods violated Miller's constitutional rights. But at 4 p.m., the governor delivered his verdict not with compassion, but with cold efficiency. After careful consideration of David Earl Miller's clemency request, I am declining to intervene in this case. Just like that, 36 years of appeals and agony were dismissed in 31 words. Minutes later, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal. That evening, as media witnesses entered the execution building, they passed a lit Christmas tree and a cheery sign that read, "You can't have a good day with a bad attitude." The irony hung in the air like static. In 2 hours, the state would kill a man in a room surrounded by holiday decorations and motivational slogans. The execution was scheduled for 7 p.m. Because before we examine how David Miller died, we must confront an even deeper truth: why he was there in the first place. Lee Standifer was not just another name in a court file. Though legal documents reduced her to clinical terms, a mentally disabled young woman, her mother described her differently: vibrant, bubbly, full of light, born with mild brain damage. Lee saw the world through a different lens, but she navigated it with courage and warmth. She read constantly, loved visiting the library, and was known for striking up conversations with ease, while abstract ideas like time confused her. Her emotional intelligence was far beyond her years. She graduated high school, lived independently at the Knoxville YW, and worked diligently at a food processing plant, where supervisors adored her reliability and kindness. She competed in the Special Olympics and won gold in backstroke. She was active in 4-H, called her mother every night without fail, and at just 23, was building a life filled with purpose, routine, and hope. But all of that ended in May 1981. 2 days before her 24th birthday, Lee met David Earl Miller at the public library. She trusted him, and when he invited her to accompany him to a minister's home in South Knoxville, she went unaware that she was stepping into a nightmare. What happened next defies comprehension. Inside the home, Miller brutally attacked her with a fireplace poker. Blood splattered the walls. He dragged her lifeless body through the house, into the yard, tied her wrists and neck with rope. The autopsy would later reveal a fractured skull, several stab wounds, one of which pierced her heart, and evidence of sexual assault. Some of the wounds had been inflicted after she was already dead. The following day, Reverend Benjamin Calvin Thomas discovered her body, but it was Lee's mother who had already alerted the police, because her daughter had missed her nightly call. That simple silence, that small deviation from routine, had told her everything. Miller's motive, prosecutors argued, was a perverse cocktail of sexual violence and domination. 9 days later, authorities found him in Ohio, arrested for passing counterfeit money. They didn't yet realize they had captured a killer. David Miller would spend 13,149 days on death row. That's 36 years in a concrete box waiting for the end. But to truly understand the meaning behind his final words, you have to understand the grueling legal journey that kept him there. In March 1982, Miller was first sentenced to death, but in 1984, the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned that sentence due to prosecutorial misconduct. In 1987, a new jury reinstated it, calling the murder especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, and so began an endless loop of appeals. From 1989 to 2018, his lawyers argued over everything, from jury instructions to ineffective counsel to constitutional rights. Each claim was denied, every door closed. Over the decades, two versions of David Miller emerged, clashing in courtrooms like ghost stories, competing for truth. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded predator, a man who targeted a vulnerable woman and killed her with unimaginable cruelty. The defense painted a broken soul, born to mentally ill parents, raped by his own mother, molested at his grandfather's direction, beaten for years by a sadistic stepfather. That violence, they said, shaped a mind plagued by psychosis, PTSD, and dissociation. On the night of the murder, Miller had allegedly consumed LSD and alcohol, which, compounded by mental illness, rendered him incapable of forming premeditated intent. Both stories contained elements of truth. Neither offered an ounce of mercy. Tennessee's 3-drug lethal injection protocol was supposed to be the modern, humane method of execution, but for those who understood what actually happened behind the curtains, it was anything but merciful. The process began with midazolam, a sedative meant to render the inmate unconscious, but critics including doctors and human rights observers argued that it didn't always work, that it only paralyzed the body, while the mind stayed fully awake, and what followed was far more terrifying. Rocuronium to shut down the muscles and breathing, and finally, potassium chloride, a chemical that stops the heart while searing through veins like acid. In other words, a slow, silent suffocation and burning to death from the inside. And this wasn't just theory. In August 2018, the state executed Billy Ray Irick using that same method. What witnesses saw left them haunted. Irick gasped, choked, and thrashed for nearly 20 minutes. His skin turned a ghostly purple. His eyes fluttered in panic. A top anesthesiologist concluded that Irick likely felt himself drowning in his own fluids, suffocating, burning, and being buried alive all at once. That horrifying possibility is what led David Earl Miller, along with 3 other death row inmates, to do something almost unthinkable in November 2018. They sued the state of Tennessee, but not to stop their execution. No, they were begging the court to let them die by firing squad instead. They knew they couldn't avoid death. They just wanted to die quickly. They argued that both available methods, lethal injection and electrocution, were cruel, but at least a firing squad would be swift and certain. The lawsuit failed. The court said it wasn't a constitutional issue, but the lawsuit revealed something even more disturbing. These men were choosing the electric chair out of fear, not preference. Tennessee law allowed inmates convicted before 1999 to choose electrocution over injection, but in reality, they were being coerced. Miller's lawyers argued that he only chose the chair because he feared the torture that might come with the needle. And yet, by choosing, the court said he had waived his right to challenge it. It was a legal paradoxy system, where constitutional rights were reduced to illusions, and every path led to death. At exactly 7:12 p.m. on December 6, 2080, the blind covering the witness chamber window slowly lifted. Behind the glass, 7 media witnesses watched as David Earl Miller sat strapped into Tennessee's infamous wooden electric chair. He looked defeated, his face pale, his head freshly shaved, his cream-colored jumpsuit sagging on his thin frame. Salt water from the damp sponges used to conduct electricity dripped slowly down his face and ankles. His eyes were open but unfocused, as if already halfway gone. Warden Tony Mays asked him for any last words. Miller mumbled, something no one could understand. When prompted again, his attorney clarified. "For the record," he said, "it beats being on death row." 4 words. But behind them, 36 years of fear, isolation, and waiting. Then came the black cloth. It was pulled down over his face and buttoned to the headpiece. At 7:16 p.m., the hum of the generator began, a low, menacing vibration. that filled the room like the sound of an approaching storm. The first jolt struck him with 1,750 volts of raw electricity. His entire body stiffened and then jerked violently upward against the leather restraints. His hands clenched into fists. His muscles spasmed. Then a pause. A second jolt, 15 seconds. This time caused his body to jump once more, before falling completely still. The hum stopped. His chest no longer moved. At 7:22 p.m., they lowered the curtain. 3 minutes later, a voice echoed through the hallway. This concludes the execution of inmate David Earl Miller. Just 9 minutes, from the first switch to the final pronouncement. Outside the prison walls, in the December cold, Miller's attorney Stephen Kissinger stood before a line of microphones. He spoke softly, calling Miller a deeply troubled man, someone who had been brutalized as a child, but who had cared deeply about his victim. Least she would be alive today, he said, if not for his sadistic stepfather. Then he asked the one question no one could escape. What did we actually do here today? David Earl Miller had just become the 1,488th person executed in the United States since 1976, the 9th in Tennessee, the 160th to die by electric chair. But behind those cold statistics loomed a far more troubling reality. Does justice really require this? Miller's execution raised questions that cut deep into the soul of the justice system. Can justice be called served when it takes nearly 4 decades to carry out a sentence, when the process itself causes more suffering than the crime it's meant to punish? What happens when retribution overrides mercy, when legal procedures bury basic human dignity beneath technicalities and legal fictions, and most haunting of all, what kind of society straps a man into a wooden chair, electrocutes him in front of witnesses, and calls that closure? Lee Standifer's mother refused to attend the execution. After 37 years, she said, "This has become about him, and I don't want to honor him in any way." She wanted it over. She wanted the focus back on her daughter. But even she couldn't ignore how the system had twisted itself in knots. Justice Sotomayor, reviewing the legal aftermath, called the case a tragedy built on outdated ideas, predictions about electric chairs made over 100 years ago. She called out the court's logic for what it was: fiction. Miller's final words, "It beats being on death row," were not just resignation, they were his truest testimony. After 36 years of solitary cells, court delays, and state-sanctioned waiting, dying was easier than living. And that, perhaps, is the greatest contradiction of all. A justice system meant to deliver accountability and peace, that instead creates new forms of pain for the inmate, for the victims' families, and for a public still unsure whether it's witnessing justice or just revenge. So now we're left with the real questions. What have we become? Was David Earl Miller beyond redemption? Or did the system fail both him and Lee? After nearly 4 decades, was this truly justice or just the ritual of vengeance? Smash that like button, subscribe, and join me for more raw, human, and unforgettable true crime stories.